I now give the floor to Ms. Victoria Tauli-Corpuz, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Let me add my voice of congratulations to your election as the chair of this session of the Permanent Forum. I am grateful for the opportunity to address the Permanent Forum and all of you attending this session to share some of my views on the issue of indigenous people's rights to self-determined development and other economic, social, environmental, and cultural rights. Dealing with this now is timely and important because the UN member states are currently negotiating the post-2015 development agenda with focus on the means on how sustainable development goals can be implemented and what indicators can be used to measure progress achieved. I would also like to share briefly with you some of the activities I undertook during my first year as a Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In my first report to the 69th session of the General Assembly in 2014, I provided some reflections on the issue of the rights of indigenous peoples, including their economic, social, and cultural rights in the post-2015 development framework, in the hope of providing some guidance to member states as they negotiate development which can bring about transformative changes. In my report, I identified obstacles and advances in achieving the economic, social, and cultural rights of indigenous peoples and offered some recommendations for addressing these rights in the context of policies and strategies to reach sustainable development goals and overcome the shortcomings of the Millennium Development Goals, especially with regards to indigenous peoples. The progressive realization of the economic, social, and cultural rights of indigenous peoples clearly cannot be achieved through the perpetuation of the dominant development paradigm, which promotes exclusive and distorted economic growth, which favors a small number of wealthy elites in certain geographical areas. The unprecedented inequality seen today within and between countries in the multiple financial, environmental, energy, and food crises the world faces speak of the failures of this economic and social development model. Indigenous peoples are among those who are suffering from this inequality. While the total population of indigenous peoples consists of 5%, they compose 15% of the world's poor. The eradication of indigenous peoples' poverty requires economic and social structural transformation, which integrates respect and protection of indigenous peoples' individual and collective rights, generation of decent jobs, reinforcement of sustainable traditional livelihoods, and indigenous entrepreneurships which can access socially and environmentally responsible investments. Indigenous peoples have the right to define and pursue their self-determined sustainable development path and priorities. Respect of their rights to their lands, territories, and resources, and to free prior informed consent are integral elements of a transformative change in development, which includes respect for their cultural integrity and diversity and promote their well-being. The complementary and cross-cutting principles of self-determination, equality, including gender equality, and non-discrimination underpin this new development path. Community-based monitoring and information systems which look into and report on how indigenous people's rights and development priorities are being implemented is a crucial component of the work in promoting a transformative development agenda. States' duty to respect, protect, and fulfill indigenous people's economic, social, and cultural rights is grounded in human rights instruments, which include the UN Declaration, ILO Convention 169, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, among others. Due to the long and complex histories of colonization and subsequent processes of nation-state building, where racism and discrimination against and marginalization of indigenous peoples persisted, states may have to adopt special measures. According to the Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination, special measures are integral to the principle of non-discrimination. Since non-discrimination has an individual and a collective dimension, special measures should not only address the socioeconomic gaps between indigenous and non-indigenous sectors of society, but also remove discriminatory barriers to the exercise of their rights to self-determined development and cultural integrity. Within the context of economic, social, and cultural rights, I am paying attention to the situation of indigenous women. In addition to the racism, discrimination, and marginalization generally faced by indigenous peoples, indigenous women have an added burden of gender-based discrimination. As noted in my first report to the Human Rights Council, I am placing special emphasis on the problems faced by indigenous women and working closely with them to ensure that their concerns are addressed consistently in my work. I am devoting my second report to the Human Rights Council, which I will submit in September 2015 to this important topic. Madam Chairperson, huge challenges remain in the implementation of economic, social, and cultural rights of indigenous peoples. Sadly, this implementation gap is reflected by the failure of the international community to use the Millennium Development Goals as a vehicle to overcome discrimination and achieve substantial equality for indigenous peoples in the context of development. In my report to the General Assembly, I laid out a non-exhaustive list of obstacles and advancements to the full realization of the rights of indigenous peoples in the context of development. Strengthening indigenous peoples' own strategies for sustainable development is not only key to achieving their economic and social and cultural rights, but it's also an indispensable element of the global efforts to achieve sustainable development. There are more evidences proving that indigenous peoples whose human rights are protected, such as their rights to their lands and territories, their right to self-determination, these people who have those rights respected have their ecosystems in a much better shape than national parks, protected or conservation areas managed by state or other external actors. Madam Chairperson, states have the duty to consult with indigenous peoples and ensure their participation before adopting legislative or administrative measures that affect them, including development projects, programs, or strategies. Reviews of the UN Development Assistance Frameworks, which constitute the main framework for the UN system development assistance at country levels, have concluded that indigenous peoples had little participation in the elaboration of such frameworks, and that most of them do not provide for disaggregated data and benchmarks related to indigenous peoples' development. The implications of this omission are simple and far-reaching. If indigenous peoples' needs and concerns are not reflected in these overall frameworks established by governments and supported by the UN system and other bilateral and multilateral donors, they may simply be excluded from development efforts, and their rights may even be further undermined. I remain deeply concerned that particular situation of indigenous peoples often remains invisible within national statistics. And I'm thankful that the Permanent Forum is continuing to push for this disaggregation. I would like to conclude the first part of my intervention by underlining that the universality of proposed sustainable development goals is a unique opportunity to address existing inequalities between indigenous and non-indigenous sectors of the population in all countries across the globe. Madam Chairperson, I would just like to add a few words on my work as a special rapporteur. As my predecessor, Professor Anaya, explained in his statements earlier, in the previous years, the various activities carried out by the Special Rapporteur can be described as falling within 4 interrelated areas of work. These are the promotion of good practices, thematic studies, country reports, and responding to cases of alleged human rights violations. I would just like to mention that in my report in the Human Rights Council, I expressed my views and thematic priorities for my mandate, and I intend to focus particular efforts over the next 3 years on issues related to the economic, social, and cultural and environmental rights of indigenous peoples. I will identify what I see as the main obstacles to the full and effective protection of the rights of indigenous peoples. Very briefly, I'd just like to outline that I did my first country visit in Paraguay, and this was held in November of last year. I also took part in various world conferences on indigenous peoples, including the World Conference. And I really think that the implementation of the formulation and implementation of national action plans of governments and the system-wide action plan of UN agencies are key to addressing the gap between indigenous peoples and the others. An important issue related to indigenous peoples is climate change, and I took part in the climate change negotiations where I had an opportunity to meet with some ministers of the Peruvian government. I also took part in, as an expert witness in the Inter-American Court on Human Rights on the case of Kalinia and Lacono peoples versus the Suriname government. And in that meeting, I had a chance to meet with the indigenous peoples of Costa Rica, as well as the Ombudsman and the Vice Minister of the Ministry to the Presidency. Madam Chair, I would not go into the other details because Albert Ditterville mentioned all the expert mechanisms that I attended. I just would like to express my thanks to governments who have the flexibility to invite me, even if I don't go to the country on an official mission. And I think this enhances more dialogues that are very much needed for me to be able to help protect and monitor the rights of indigenous peoples. In conclusion, I would just like to say that I intend to work and to carry out my mandate, and I do so with optimism for a better future for indigenous peoples, encouraged by positive developments in many places, and yet concerned by the reality of ongoing struggles and violations of indigenous peoples throughout the world. I continue to reaffirm my strong commitment to my role as Special Rapporteur, while I acknowledge with humility the responsibility it represents. I thank you, Madam Chair, and all of you for your attention. Thank you.